Yours. I will give you a good introduction. Yeah, it looks good. All right, so Sarah Farley is a local food system and small farms educator with University of Illinois Extension. She serves Lake and McHenry counties. She is committed to enhancing producer success through knowledge extension and collaborative efforts aimed at achieving their farm goals. Sarah's main interests are in regenerative agriculture, specifically livestock integration and soil health, food access, and empowering compost ambassadors. Among the livestock species, Sarah is drawn to the small ruminants due to their fit into many small farm operations, market opportunities, and her history of raising and exhibiting them for many years. A Pennsylvania native, she earned her bachelor's in animal science from Penn State and a master's from Virginia Tech, where she also served as an extension educator at both institutions before joining the Illinois team, bringing a wealth of experience and dedication to her current role. With that, I'll let you take it away, Sarah.
Thank you, Grant. And thank you everyone for joining us on a lovely March evening. Again, I'm Sarah Farley. I'm really pleased to talk to you tonight about an interesting and maybe icky topic for some, integrating internal parasite management for sheep and goat producers. So we have a lot we're going to talk about today. So here's the agenda for the day. We're going to start talking about the problem and the issues with internal parasites. We'll start to introduce some of the common internal parasites and what their basic biology are, and clinical symptoms to look out for in your herd or flock. Then we'll dive into factors that influence parasitism and prevention and control strategies through implementix and management strategies. Hopefully at the end, we'll have an opportunity to have some question and answer session where I'll be able to really help guide you in anything that you have questions about. So what's the big deal and why am I bringing up this topic in a beginning livestock series for folks who maybe just getting started? Well, the truth is internal parasites are a big issue in animal health. Last year, I actually brought this up in our meat goat production session, where I emphasized that internal parasites are one of the biggest killers of sheep and goats, and they can cause really big challenges to your herd or flock, whether those be economic losses, health decline of your animals, or it can lead to resistance issues in the major dewormers on the market. And that's just certainly a challenging piece for your control for your operation and also to the bottom line of your operation. I understand that many are looking to make a profit in your sheep and goat business. And even if you're a hobbyist, you probably don't want your goats to burn a hole in your pocket, if you will, or lose your favorite animal. So that's why I really think that this is an important topic to bring up in March. So you can start planning as prior planning prevents poor performance. To kind of add to this need, the USDA National Animal Health Monitoring Systems send out they send out a survey every so often to gain input from producers as well as veterinarians and extension personnel and others involved in the industry. And in that needs assessment survey, and these are the two most recent ones from 2021 and 2018, internal parasites were listed at the top of disease, disorder, and pathogen priorities. And these were weighted issues. So this again emphasizes the need and importance of education, of prevention, and of kind of getting your management tools in place to be able to respond whenever you have issues. So you may be wondering, how do you know if your animals have parasites? Well, generally they do, and it's a normal situation. All grazing sheep and goats are infected with a community of internal parasites, whether those be those gastrointestinal parasites or others that are shed in a certain environment. So it's just inevitable that your animals have some sort of parasite because of how they consume their feed and forage. So it's really important to know when there's a problem. So a great way to do that is to be making sure that you're monitoring your herd or flock, your animals very closely, because the goal is not to create a parasite-free animal because you won't be able to do that, but you want to be able to prevent clinical diseases and reduce those production losses. So let's look at some common signs of internal parasitism. So here's a long list on the left of some things that you may see in some of your animals throughout their life. So of course, weight loss. Perhaps this is them not getting the nutrients they need, or those internal parasites taking the nutrients or causing havoc on some of their immunity. You may see some diarrhea in your herd or flock, and you can usually detect this by a dirty tail or a mucky butt of your animal, typically those younger animals. Rough hair coat, like the one seen in the bottom left, that's kind of one way to know that your animal's having a severe case or an infection of parasites, as well as weakness, depression, like the one in the top right, weakness, just not getting around as often. They're typically easier to catch or unstable when walking. And among the bottom, the anemia and bottle jaw, these are clinical symptoms typically of our common, most severe issues with the barber pole worm, where those worms are consuming blood and causing, you'll be able to see some of these signs through their mucous membranes in their eyes and under their lip. And in bottle jaw, this is typically seen in those stomach worms and liver flukes. These animals will have swelling under their jaw or have that accumulation of fluid there. And sometimes that can also spread to the abdomen. So in severe cases, your animals may suddenly die, perhaps, especially those infected with barber pole worm or some of these other that may have other clinical signs. So this just kind of get us started to thinking about this is what an animal looks like when they have a high load of parasite infection. So since we know a little bit about what to look out for and why this is an important issue, now let's look at what the best steps are to manage and to develop your own tool of defense for tackling these issues. The first is to know your enemies. So to be able to identify what types of internal parasites are out there that are of concern. Know your weaknesses, to understand those factors that are sometimes hard to control. Knowing your strengths. So after this presentation, or maybe you already have a lot of these strengths, you'll have knowledge to do better and to have more control options in your pocket. And then finally, proper management. So those plans, those action steps, and those tools to act and to manage the problem. So in general, there are two kinds of internal parasites that affect sheep and goats. And so it's important to, again, know your enemy. The two main types are our helminths, or commonly called our worms, and our protozoa type internal parasites, which are single-celled eukaryotes. There are three types of helminths: our nematodes, also called roundworms, also called gastrointestinal parasites, also called stomach worms, and even more technical is the strongyles. And among those, the barber pole worm is our biggest one of concern and most problematic. Other types of helminths are cestodes, or tapeworms. These are maybe some that you may see with the visible eye in manure, but are not typically something of concern. They're just really gross to look at and to find in your pasture or in your barn. And then we have our flukes, like your liver flukes, that may cause a significant threat, but maybe not as big of a concern as our barber pole worm. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on the barber pole worm and coccidia species, but we'll touch over some of the others as well. So I started talking about it, but barber poleworm or Haemachus contortus is the internal parasite of concern. It is the most prevalent and the most highly pathogenic and often deadliest parasite that infects sheep and goats. It is a blood feeder, so it has a tooth at the end that lacerates the inside of that stomach and feeds on the blood of that animal. And it can consume quite a bit, especially if there's a high infestation. So actually, adult females can produce up to 10,000 eggs per day. So they're highly prolific again, and that they complete their life cycle in as little as 3 weeks. So about 21 days. And if each worm consumes 1 to 5 drops of blood daily, a goat infected with 1,000 of these parasites will lose nearly a pint of blood in a week. So this is where we see kind of quick loss of animals and something to be concerned about. So this is a really important slide, and I'm going to talk you through the direct life cycle of a barber poleworm. And this life cycle is common among those roundworms. Again, it's a direct life cycle. So the animal picks up this parasite through larvae in a pasture type situation. Those adults attach, they develop into their larval form stage into adults in the stomach, in the abomasum, which is the last compartment of the stomach of a ruminant. And it's the true stomach. And so I talked to you a little bit about how that laceration happens. Then those females lay their eggs and pass those in the feces. So those eggs, imagine 10,000 eggs in just one pile of manure, and like throughout the day. And so those feces, those ova, are in that pellet, and those they then hatch, especially in a period of rain or in high humid situations. And those larvae molt into three stages. So they eventually get to larval 3, but they're consuming on that manure, the bacteria in the manure for those first few days. And the period of time it takes is roughly 5 to 6 days from when those eggs are laid until they develop into that larval 3 stage in ideal conditions. After it reaches that larval 2 stage, it will again molt into larval 3 stage, and this is the infective stage. So this is really when those larvae are able to move out of the manure and able to climb up those blades of grass up to 2 to 3 inches, or as far out horizontally as 1 foot, moving around in that pasture area, trying to reach an area where they will be consumed and continue their life cycle. So this 3rd stage is a really important stage because this is when they are infective. They also, at this point of time, they're able to, their mouth area is covered, so they're surviving off of their own energy, so that they're really waiting and excited to get consumed. And then a grazing goat or sheep will consume them and continue that life cycle. Again, this whole life cycle takes about 21 days. And it's really important, again, to recognize this because the ideal scenarios, there are management factors that you can consider and control within certain periods during this life cycle. Clinical signs, as I started to mention, are anemia. So looking out for those pale mucous membranes like you're seeing in this top left image, looking out for those pale membranes. You may also see this in that eye membrane. These are 2 clinical signs to really keep an eye out for. And there are scorecards called the FAMACHA test that can tell you how infective your animal is on a scale from 1 to 5. That edema that I already talked a little bit about bottle jaw, you can see this here at the bottom of this image in the bottom right. This can sometimes be confused with some other disorders. So it's very important to kind of look at some photos, talk to your veterinarian to see if your animal may have this clinical sign. Ill thrift is another word for slower growth, weakness, loss of weight, and sudden death. One thing to really note about the barber poleworm infections are you're not going to typically see diarrhea as a characteristical sign for this type of infection. Now, it may not, there's a chance that an animal may have contracted other types of worms that may have caused diarrhea, but this is not typically something that we will see. Moving on to other types of nematode or roundworms, we have our round stomach worm. In the literature, you may see this as the Osteragia. They produce those females lay a lot fewer eggs, so 50 to 100 compared to up to 10,000. And they consume in a different way. So they're a stomach lining feeder versus that blood feeder. You may see these in cool, moist environments, which is a little bit different from that barber poleworm. Barber poleworms thrive in warm, humid environments. So this is something we might see this time of year, perhaps. And clinical signs of this will have that poor appetite, weight loss, diarrhea, ill thrift. May see some bottle jaw in this case and some death. But again, less common, but it is something that you may see. And I have listed here a guide to internal parasites of ruminants. If you are one, we'll talk about this a little bit later. If you choose to get a fecal egg count or learn to do your own McMaster fecal egg test to see and observe what type of internal parasites you have, there's a guide that will show you the different images that you may see in your slides. Another one is the bankrupt or black scour worm, or the Trichostrongyles species. Again, having that strongylus, that's a key word in the Hellmann roundworm name. These species or other gastrointestinal worms typically found in the stomach, sometimes in the small intestines, and they produce much fewer eggs per day as well, and have kind of similar signs as that round stomach worm, but diarrhea is a main one, along with anorexia, poor coat, weight loss, etc. The thing about the black scour worm is you might see a darker scour or darker diarrhea, and that might be an indicator of this one. Looks like a busy slide, but I did want to acknowledge the other type of worms of less significance. I talked briefly on the common tapeworm. They have a flat ribbon shape, and they're often found, they live in the small intestine of animals, and they make up segments that contain eggs, and that's how those are passed. Actually, an animal consumes a pastoral, why am I not thinking? Not a tick. I'm going to move on because the word's leaving my head. But a pasture mite is what they consume. And that's how that tapeworm really develops. Another, especially in your goats, perhaps, that may browse, you may experience or may see a case of meningeal or brainworm. These causes neurological issues when the parasite moves into the spinal cord and travels into the brain. And it is a parasite typical of a white-tailed deer. And when they excrete that in their feces, it has an indirect life cycle. So those slugs and snails are needed for that infection. So it's a really unique one. It's one of those only ones that affects that neurological issue. I personally have had a goat get affected with this, and it was quite crazy. I learned a lot during that period of time in talking with our veterinarian. Another is the lungworm, most commonly seen in cattle, but sheep and goats can also be affected, and this can lead to respiratory issues, also has that indirect life cycle. Liver flukes are another one, has an indirect life cycle. Anytime you're seeing the slug or snail here, on the image, just think that this, you may see something like this if you're letting your animals graze around browse area or in like a standing water type of situation. It's more susceptible in those areas. And then the ones we have here at the bottom, these are roundworms or gastrointestinal, and some that you may also see. The threadworm is a funky one in that it can be, consumed regularly, or it can, make its way through the hoof and then through the body. It's really, really strange. You can go for days in research learning about these different internal parasites. It's pretty fascinating. Moving on to our protozoa one that I said I wanted to talk a little bit more. This one is one that you may be more familiar with. It can cause damage to the small intestine lining, and problems can sometimes be irreversible. So this is something that you definitely want to keep an eye out, especially with your young animals, because they are more susceptible. And this is, I'll show you the life cycle here in a second, but it's passed through oocyst, and it can be ingested through feed, water, and other contaminated environments. So sanitation is a really big thing in reducing your coccidia numbers in this emeris species. There are many species of coccidia out there, but the ones that affect sheep and goats are typically these. And stressor is another indicator that can affect sheep and goats. So we want to try to reduce those stressors, especially at time of weaning, especially in those unsanitary conditions, trying to reduce overcrowding, poor health of other animals, and poor nutrition. So you'll typically see clinical signs of diarrhea, poor growth, weight loss, dehydration, weakness, anorexia, death. And coccidia stats are typically what is used to treat these animals in either the milk or a starter feed. And so I'd recommend talking to your veterinarian to make sure you're identifying this correctly, and also so you're treating appropriately at the right time. So kind of differing a little bit in the life cycle from the direct life cycle we looked earlier to this protozoa type. From egg to infectious could be from 1 to 2 days, but the coccidia can live for 2 to 3 months and can survive up to a year in optimum conditions. And so sanitation, again, is really important. And it's killed by direct sunlight and low humidity. So those humidity under 25% typically. And you'll see signs around 17 days from infection. So immunity builds with exposure to in the right amounts. It builds, and warmth and moisture really permit that sporulation of those species. So something to consider. All right, transitioning a bit to factors that influence parasitism. There are a number of factors. I really hope you kind of picked up on a few, especially around the temperature and humidity. We're going to talk through these in more of like animal factors and environmental factors. But let's start with our environmental factors. So temperature and humidity, the key ones to remember. Thinking about back to that Haemachus contortus barber pole worm, those worm eggs hatch anywhere from 45 to 100 degrees. So that's a very broad range, but they can develop quite quickly in warmer weather and slower in those cooler weather situations. And we do know that many of the eggs, especially the barber pole worm, they are killed during the larvae, excuse me, are killed during freezing temperatures, but some are cold tolerant, especially the brown stomach worm, those type of larvae. And they can survive up to 2 months, so 60 days in those hot weather conditions, and even longer in cool weather. Because thinking back of that larval 3 stage, they kind of slow down a little bit. They're preserving their energy, and they're not using as much as their energy, excuse me, in those warm pieces. So they're able to hold some of those fat reserves and live longer. The humid conditions, of course, things need water to survive, especially our parasites. So all stages need that moisture, and a larvae can be destroyed sanitized by drying. And I just thought this was kind of a cute little nerdy a graphic cartoon showing the male and the female barber pole worm, the male being very happy that it was consumed there after 3 months. So this graphic just kind of shows those main periods of times in general of when those pasture larvae number might be higher or lower, depending on wet or dry conditions. So in the spring, we typically have higher fecal egg counts, higher larval counts, which we'll talk a little bit later about why that happens. And then those decrease over time, and then we hit a period of warmer, wet weather, which increases those in a typical normal year. Now, we had some drought-like conditions in northern Illinois the past few years, so maybe that has helped with some of our parasite issues. But again, it's a little inconsistent, and we might have a higher, with a wet fall, we might have more internal parasites as well. So I want to mention this, that it's really important when we talk later about pasture rest and pasture management. That is really crucial to keeping our pasture larva numbers down. Transitioning to our animal factors. So the 3 key things to remember are the animal's immune response, the seasonality and pregnancy status of those sheep and goats, and the nutrition. So animals typically develop immunity to internal parasites over time, but those young animals and those pregnant animals may be more susceptible until that immunity is developed. So that's something really important to remember, as well as those stress-like conditions, they can reduce that immune response. And if there are other diseases, other sicknesses, that animal may also have a harder time managing their internal parasites and have it may perpetuate the problem. Thinking of seasons, this is something I only have in 2 bullets here, but I really want to emphasize the hyperbiosis. Those larvae that are ingested in the fall, they can go into a hibernation period, if you will, or arrested development is the true definition of hyperbiosis, that occurs when conditions are not conducive to the entire life cycle to be complete for that nematode. So it survives the winter, and then in the spring, when there's a change in weather, change in hormones, especially among our pregnant ewes, there may be that spring rise or the peripertuent egg rise. That's a well-documented phenomenon where those small ruminants have a temporary loss of natural acquired immunity to those internal parasites. So it can begin approximately about 2 weeks before parturition and continues for up to 8 weeks after that period of lambing and kidding. The last factor to note is nutrition. Good nutrition really does stimulate this immune system, and an increase of protein levels, especially with those young animals or those lactating females, may up to like 130% increase of that daily requirement can help manage some of those internal parasites. So we learned about life cycles, we learned about different types of internal parasites. This is really where management comes in next. So how do we control them? Mainly through, come on now, reducing exposure, so management, and attacking the wards in the animal. So using our tools that we have available to us to kill those internal parasites when your animal is sick in that clinical stage. So to reduce exposure, I'm going to have a few slides that talks about the various locations where we're reducing exposure. Let's start with pasture. I talked at the beginning that internal parasites are common among grazing animals. It's just the way it is. So when we are exposing our animals to pasture, we want to make sure we're prioritizing the most vulnerable animals like our babies, our lactating ewes and does, or other vulnerable animals, have the cleanest pasture first. So that pasture that has not been grazed, has had a long period of rest, at least 60 days before or at the beginning of the year when you have that appropriate growth, giving them that first and then running the rest of your animals on that pasture. Practicing pasture rotation. Pasture rotation, regenerative grazing, all of those pieces, so important. Making sure you have more than one paddock, not continuously grazing your animals, and coming up with a plan and figuring out how to manage this, especially if you already have a problem with internal parasites. You need a plan or want to get ahead of this. So length of rest between rotation ideally is 60 days. 45 days is okay. And it's important to use proper stocking rates. So making sure you have the appropriate number of animals per acre in that space. Now, I will note that managed intensive grazing, a type of grazing that optimizes forage and where you move your animals more often, it may not be as effective in controlling or managing internal parasites as it is, as you know, with cattle. So definitely look into that. We do have a great resource on pasture management and rotation that Doug Gucker did last year, and I recommend checking that out if you kind of want to dig a little bit more on pasture rotation and those in stocking rates. For sheep and goats, we want to make sure we're monitoring the forage between those rotations, making sure that it is at least 4 inches high, remembering that those larvae can get up to 2 to 3 inches height. So that's what we're really checking for, and we can consider that too in our pasture rotation. If you have other species like cattle and horses, they can be used in a multi-species or co-grazing type of situation. They don't contract the same type of internal parasites or not as vulnerable to the ones that sheep and goats are. So they can essentially be a pasture or a vacuum following the sheep and goats. You can potentially use alternative forages, let your goats browse. We want our heads up out of the grass, remembering that that's where that larvae is moving around, staying alive. And you may consider adding a type of supplement, nematologus, can't talk right now, fungus, such as biowarma or livamol. These two can be added to feeds, and that fungus actually attacks that larva in the manure. So it's a pretty cool tool to reduce those larva numbers. Here I have this image of some kids grazing and a close-up view of some barber pole worms on a droplet of water. So crazy to look at up close, and you can see how many there are visible to the eye. So this image is just to kind of remind us that pasture rotation is important and forage height is important. I include a funky little picture of a rubber boot, because if you have like a muck boot or something like that, the top of that toe could be about 3 inches. But a great way to really know your pasture height is to get out there with a walking stick. If you have a pasture stick, that's great, or something else to just be walking your pastures. Know what you're seeing, drag those pastures perhaps to break up those pellets, those fecal pellets, so those larvae will die and dry out much faster. There has been research that shows that pure stands of chicory, bird's foot trefoil, and the Cerensea lepidsia have been shown to reduce fecal egg counts and larval development. So here are 3 of those stands as examples. Another place you can reduce exposure is there in the barn. So I emphasize, especially with coccidia, that good sanitation is so important. So making sure to keep feeders off the ground, to make sure you're cleaning out your buckets, checking to make sure no fecal materials in those feeders or in your water. That's really, really important. And not overstocking pens. You may also choose to isolate or deworm new animals, considering that those animals that you're purchasing may be bringing new parasite or dewormer resistance to your herd. So making sure that they are able to defecate in one area, you clean that up really well and move on after that cycle. This image is a picture from I took in Turkey last summer and of a unique breed of sheep. But you can see that the way this part of the barn was designed, those sheep can get up and graze on top of different areas, defecating in other areas. We do see that there is a feeder there that is off the ground, but they're already picking around in those different areas. So they have the potential to pick up different type of internal parasites. Another location to reduce exposure is in the barnyard. This is something I see as a potential issue, and another reason why I really wanted to talk about internal parasites as I'm driving around my area in northern Illinois. A lot of folks get started in sheep and goats and are kind of more hobbyists, and they allow their animals to get out and graze right around their barn or right at the pen, and those pastures get chewed down really low, and there tends to be a lot more manure around the barn area. So there's more concerns and more potential to pick up something in those spaces. So on the left, I have a few different recommendations of what you can do to reduce that exposure, whether that's laying down a different material, closing off access, making certain alleys, and really thinking about your pasture or fence design to keep that area of barnyard or kind of exercise area smaller, and really using your land for pasture and pasture rotation. If you don't have the ability to do that, consider zero grazing. So having a dry lot with very little forage or grass available, so you're not down there nibbling. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing type of situation, but you'll have healthier animals than out in a barnyard type of situation. Another way you can reduce exposure is through genetic selection. So selecting either species or using the data that you have at your fingertips to select for genetically resistant or those resilient animals. It has been said that there's research that shows this, that 20 to 30% of the flock shed the most parasitic eggs. So they're creating the bigger problems and exposing your other healthy animals. So this may be hard to do, again, among those maybe 4-H or show folks or hobbyists to cull those worm susceptible animals. But if you want to make a profit and if you really want to have healthy animals over the long term, this is something that you should really consider. You can also look into parasite resistant breeds. So you can determine this by using fecal egg count as an indicator to really know what those parasitic loads are at high times of year. Or there's some of these breeds suggest that they may have a higher resistance, but the best way to check that is really through those fecal egg counts. But the Katahdins, the hair sheeps, etc., they tend to be more resistant to internal parasites. There's still not a lot of evidence out there. Goats are really susceptible to internal parasites, but some of these that maybe they browse a little bit better, or the myotonics that are native to the United States, they may have better resistance to internal parasites. All right, so we learned some things that you can reduce exposure. Now let's talk about what control measures you do have at your fingertips and how to use those responsibly. There are there are 3 classes of dewormers available on the market, and it's suggested to do targeting deworming. So only deworming the animals that need it, not your entire flock or herd like you used to. That's kind of an older practice that maybe some folks that have been doing this for a while are used to kind of having their dewormer program. But this can really, really create a lot of resistance and something that we want to try to avoid in best management practices. So know that the majority of your animals have a lower a parasite load or have developed their own immunity and ability to fight off some of these, but some do not, and you do need to use a control measure to make them feel better and to reduce some of those loads. There's been more and more research about copper boluses and how they can be a potential complement to a deworming program. Do note that sheep are more susceptible to copper, and so you need to be careful with that. And I know that there's been a lot of folks interested or exploring, or there's a lot of talk out there on the feeds, the Reddits, the Facebook pages about non-chemical dewormers. There's just not a lot of research that shows the effectiveness of these. Examples that people have tried are like botanical dewormers or herbs, diatomaceous earth. But again, no scientific studies have shown that diatomaceous earth or other non-chemical treatments to reduce those fecal egg counts. I've even been interested in exploring a little bit around if pumpkins, there's been some research about pumpkin seeds, if they reduce those worm numbers, and just the quantity needed to be consumed is just not enough to reduce. So it could help a little bit, but again, we're not recommending those because there's just not enough research. And there was an episodic study that showed that higher doses are actually toxic to that host animal. Here is an image of some dewormers on the market. And here are the three classes. So we have our benzimidols, I'm just gonna save the colors of the drenches just to save time and effort here. The yellow drenches and the clear purple drenches. Initially, I had highlighted some of these to show what's approved for sheep and what's approved for goats because it really varies. Not all of these are approved for sheep and not all of these are approved for goats. In fact, there's quite limited options out there on the market on what's FDA approved and available. So it's quite common that there needs to be an extra label or extra drug label that through your veterinarian, through a veterinary client-patient relationship, that you're able to do off-label treatments of your animal. So it's important to talk with them. I also really recommend looking into these tables that are available on the American Consortium for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. They have specific dosage recommendations based on the weight of the animal. There's also combination treatments that might be effective if you've already experienced resistance in your herd that you can consider. And another thing to note is that that goats specifically might need higher doses of some of these drugs because they're able to process them much faster. So it's really, really important when you do need to deworm your animals to deworm them with the proper dosage. Another thing to just quickly note before I move on is just be aware of those withdrawal times of your animal, especially if you plan to send them to sale or something like that. If you haven't already dewormed any of your animals or used a drench gun, deworming should always be given orally. So beware of the injectables. That's not as effective on sheep and goats. You always want to do an oral drench formulation, making sure that you are drenching over the tongue into that oral cavity, having the proper equipment to do that. Again, reminder to follow the labels and your veterinarian's guidance and dose on that proper weight, store that properly. And if you need to do combination treatments, don't mix your dewormers, give those each individually. There is a real problem with dewormer resistance. This is another issue of why it ranks so high as a top priority to focus on for sheep and goat producers. So deworm resistance is the ability for that worm to just survive a dose of dewormer and pass down those resistant genes to its next generation. So imagine how fast that can happen in the Haemachus contortus, those barber pole worms, they can develop resistance really, really fast. And RD wormers have been on the market since the 1960s. So those old programs, like I mentioned, of worming your whole herd or flock, that is one of the reasons why we have resistance today. And it's developed through frequent exposure and also can be a cause from underdosing. So if you're not weighing your animals and you're thinking, I think they weigh 100 pounds and they actually weigh much more than that, then you're potentially creating a resistance problem because you're not killing all of those worms during that treatment. Also incorrect dosage, incorrect calibration of, so it's important to check these things, and there are some tools out there to remind you and to guide you on how to do those. Fecal egg counts are the best way to know if the drug works. And this fecal egg counts are typically taken around the summer, not the spring, because animals tend to have a higher fecal egg count in the spring. And if you have the ability or interest in the funds to do this, I admit it's not cheap, but it will pay off in the long run if you have a resistance issue. It's best to compare those treatments once and then 10 to 14 days later to kind of see what those counts are and how effective that treatment was. In the spring, you may see a fecal egg count of 500. That's when you would want to treat. And then the fall, 200 fecal eggs per gram is another period of time you may want to treat. But again, consult your veterinarian for guidance. There are a number of tools to help you make informed deworming decisions, thinking of those clinical signs, looking, at your herd or flock and seeing how their health is. I mentioned that FAMACHA card. This is an eye anemia system. It's only effective for paying attention and understanding when to treat the barber for those barber pole worm infections. It's a scale, again, from 1 to 5. If it is at 4 or 5, those would be areas to treat, that lighter color. A 3, maybe. It depends. You might want to treat your lambs or kids at that category. Another thing you can do is you can do a body condition score. And if you have sheep, it's really important to get handle your animals to really see what their body condition is. And this will help you understand, how thrifty they are, and what if they're feeling a little bit bony, that's an indicator that your animal has a lower body condition score and may potentially need treatment, considering all of the factors. Another thing you can do is the 5-point check. This is kind of more of this accounts for all worms. One of these is the eye test. One of these is the back test, so that's combining both the FAMACHA and the body condition score. It also includes the looking out for that jaw area for swelling, the nose area, and the tail for, those DAG scores. It's always important too to keep records of when you are treating your animals, when you are seeing different scores in your animals, when you're seeing diarrhea, etc. So there are templates out there. Cornell actually has some of these available on their website, and I'll link to that at the end. But this way you can really see, okay, this animal I'm having to treat more. This animal is having higher FAMACHA scores much longer, or more diarrhea type symptoms. So these might be an indicator of which animals to cull or which ones to keep, because remember, genetic selection is really important for the long term of your operation, and overall for your profitability too. So something to keep in mind. So there's a lot of information, and so what can you do now this time of year? It's giving me trouble. So you can go out into your barn, into your pastures, and look for contamination and make those management decisions as soon as possible. You can monitor your animals for those clinical signs regularly, making notes and observing their behavior. And if they have some of those clinical concerning signs, keep an eye on your susceptible animals, especially those young or those mothers who just had their kids and lambs. Provide proper nutrition, making sure you're meeting the basic nutrition demands of your animals, whether that be through their forage or through their supplemental minerals, and water, of course, is important, and much more. And consider increasing those protein levels of those susceptible animals at key periods of time throughout the year. Look at your pasture management plan. It's never too early to think about pasture management and how you're going to rotate and plan out making sure you have enough pasture. In some state situations, you may need to mow. So knowing when you need to get in there and mow in between can help break the cycle as well. Get to know your vet. I recognize that there are very few veterinarians that have specialties in small ruminants, but the more you can develop a relationship with them, let them know that you took this class and gain some more resources. You can look at those drug charts that I mentioned and take that to them to see what would be the best plan of action and best tools for control of some of the parasites of high infections. You may choose to take the FAMACHA training to get one of those cards so you can really compare that eye for anemic levels. The FAMACHA piece does require a training to get the card. So if that's something you're interested, let me know. I'm not yet a trainer, but I am interested in being one if we have enough demand for it. And certainly keep good records. So this kind of wraps up our presentation. I want to summarize in saying that internal parasites are definitely something of concern in to many small producers, large producers, and it can wreak havoc on your operation, or with proper management, you can reduce some of those effects. So it does involve a combination of factors, so integrated parasite management is so important. So monitor your animal's environments to reduce that exposure and support that animal health. Practice rotational grazing, good grazing practices, including keeping an eye on that pasture height. Attack those worms through the appropriate dewormers with your vet-approved treatment. And of course, using your tools and resources to make informed decisions. So here are a number of resources that I pulled from to create today's presentation. There are a number of great trainings out there that I recommend looking into. The key ones that I would say to talk about, actually all of them, but definitely this one here at the top. There are a number of printout resources that you can look at, fact sheets related to the biology of internal parasites, those recommended treatments. You can go on that website to get an online FAMACHA training as well. It's through the University of Rhode Island, but it links directly there. There's a University of Maryland small ruminant page. This has a plethora of information around sheep and goat management. And one of the key authors of that, the one who manages that, Susan Shoninian, she is just a great she paves the path in this area, in extension at least. And I acknowledge that some of the content in my slides today came from her on her SlideShare, or bits and pieces of it. ATRA has a ton of resources, as well as Cornell, Rhode Island, and Ohio State. So this is where I would recommend going first before you dive deeper. And with that, I have a needs assessment survey. All of these slides will be provided to Grant to send out to you along with the recording later, but I wanted to mention our Small Farmers Needs Assessment Survey. We want to know how you want to receive information in the case that there is a animal disease outbreak, and how you can respond and get notified immediately. So please take a minute to complete this. And now I'll take time for questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah. This is really informative. I just didn't know anything about this topic, and so it was a really, really great overview. So as folks have questions, please place them in the chat box. As Sarah mentioned, I will certainly send out her handouts as well as the links that you mentioned to Sarah. Um, to kind of get us going, I guess, tonight with some questions, you just think about like a budget for this. I mean, how much are we really talking about on a yearly basis? Or is that even more about how big our flock, or not flock, I'm sorry, but our group of sheep and goats are, that would determine it more? Oh, you're muted, Sarah. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Yeah, the cost can vary. I think that dewormers are typically cheaper than, some of the additional things like your copper boluses and your fecal egg counts. It really depends on what lab you go to do fecal egg counts. That's why I said that there are tests out there um, there's trainings out there so you could do it yourself if you have access to a microscope. So it's not a direct answer, but I can definitely look and see if there is a budget out there that can help folks know kind of what the range of some of those dewormer treatments are per animal, perhaps.
You mentioned establishing a relationship with a vet. As I think about starting that conversation, right? I mean, are there certain things that I want to look for in a vet, and also what information should I be upfront and sharing if they maybe don't have a background in this?
Yeah, so you can kind of ask around your local, you can ask your local extension agent, you can ask if you don't already have a vet, you can talk to the Farm Bureau, or talk to other farmers to see who they use for a vet. Um, Especially other sheep and goat producers ask who they use for their vet because this will be, it's key for you'll have emergencies. It's a situation. So you can talk to them and see, and then you can call them up. I called up a bunch of veterinarians to say, hey, what are some of the issues that you're seeing? Um, where do you go? What's your radius that you travel? Those are some things you can do. There's also a state record of all of the veterinarians across the state. So you can contact that website and get connected. They'll tell you who's in your general geography, and they may have details of like what their specialty is. So it's just you're gonna have to do your research. Some vets work for some people and don't work for others. So it all depends.
Is there you thinking about kind of our planting zones, right? Like, is there any differences? And I know you work with Teresa Steckler as well. I mean, does
Hmm.
she see things differently in Southern Illinois compared to what we might be seeing in Northern Illinois when it comes to the internal parasites?
Yeah, they tend to have more thinking like in that warm, humid environment. They have a
Mm.
longer period of warm, humid environment. So, um, and also in talking with some of other producers that I know in Central Illinois and who they sell their show animals to, they've said Southern Illinois has had more problems.
Mm.
But we know our climate is being a little weird, We're having some climate change effects. We're having a warmer spring. This is why I think it's a really timely thing to think about ahead of time before you already have an infection, and why we're talking about this in March. When lambing is happening and when you may be contaminating your pastures potentially. So I think that it's seen across the United States. Barber poleworm is not just a southern US type of thing. Actually, the southern part of the US, there's drier conditions, they don't have these type of issues.
Mm.
So last summer, I attended the National Extension Agents annual meeting in Iowa and talked with a number of educators across the country, especially those who have specialty in sheep and goat production. And I was talking to folks all the way up in North Dakota about how they're handling this and what they're seeing. And one of the graphics was from Canada, so this extends this affects everyone. Any type of animal that grazes, that consumes forage is going to have some type of internal parasite.
Okay. I don't see any questions in the chat box. One final one, I guess, from me, if no one has any others. Uh, how does it develop resistance? Like how is it like how are some species developing resistance to it? Have they found any research that determines that?
Well, one of the challenges is that there's just so few controls.
Mm.
Um, and within those chemical classes, when it's being repeatedly
Oh,
used,
sure.
those animals or those worms are developing that type of resistance so that they are, mating, those worms are mating and perpetuating the problem because it's a genetic issue especially when you're using the same chemicals to kill that those have already been resilient from. So there are some terms, and I have some additional slides in case this type of question came up, but um, it's that's why the combination treatment is now one of those recommended things. So you're killing more broad spectrum, multiple types of parasites during that phase.
Sure. And then you mentioned there were certain like goat species that have resistance too. So like how is that? Like they're resistant to some of those parasites you were kind of one of your slides said.
Oh yeah, the sheep and goats, like the hair sheep, tend to have more resilience.
Resilient, sure.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Mhm.
I think it's just, you know, genetic a genetic piece that has been considered. So I have to look a little bit more into that research of why certain breeds have it than others.
Well, I don't see any questions in the chat box. So want to thank you again for such
Yeah.
an important presentation. And this, of course, will be recorded and we will upload it to YouTube next week. And we will send out a link to this for everyone to view along with your resources. So, thanks again for being here tonight, everyone. And thanks again for also being part of our 2024 series. We will return in 2025 with